In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 true, eerie stories about cabins hidden deep in Appalachia. Every story is a cautionary tale. Some doors should stay closed. But before we begin, please consider subscribing. Don't forget to like the video and share it with your loved ones. I'd also like to know where you're listening. Thank you all for your support. It is very significant to me. Now let's begin. Story 1. October had just begun. I had been camping by myself for a few years at that point, mostly to unwind. The greater the distance, the better. I relished the silence, the distance, and just walking until it seemed like the world was far away. That weekend, I went deep into the forest, maybe 8 miles off the main road, near Rowan County, Kentucky. There are no trails, just a fading elk path and the remnants of some old logging roads that were more brush than road. Right then, I wasn't really aiming for anything. I had no intention of following a route or locating a landmark. I just walked over the ridge, kind of sleeping, with one eye on my compass. Then I discovered a shallow, mostly dry creek bed covered with moss. I stumbled and fell hard, maybe 10 feet, onto shale and packed leaves after stepping onto a flat rock. My leg took the brunt of the blow, and it hurt like hell, but nothing else was hurt. For a while, I just sat there, catching my breath and swearing. That's when I saw the roof. Through a thicket of mountain laurel to the side, I could just make out the edge of a sloping tin roof, greenish and corroded around the edges. I felt chilly. There was no sign of a structure on my topo map. I had seen no barns, no fences, no signs of recent human activity, but it was there. I got up and moved slowly in its direction, getting stranger with every step. The cabin stared off. It is indeed old, but undamaged. No vegetation choking the siding, no vines climbing the porch. Just as if to give the monster space, the forest had stopped around it. The construction was simple. One room, a stone chimney on one side, and a porch with 3 deteriorating steps. Down the center of the bottom step was a long, straight divide. The front door was no longer on its hinges. It lay against the doorway as though it had been taken out and set aside on purpose. Not because I thought anyone was inside, but just out of habit, I called out. No response. I assumed control. The dust was all over it. The thick, undisturbed kind that muffles sound when you move. But there was no odor, no mildew, no decay. Not even the smell of desertion. It just didn't smell of anything. Knife carvings on the far wall, a thin metal bed frame in one corner, a rusted stove, a couple of old boxes with cracked enamel cups inside, and broken springs protruding through. Many of them were just dates, but they were all dates: 1989, 1977, 1961, and 1953. They're all in rows, neat, precise, and consistent. Without names, initials, or context, time was recorded as a habit. There was also a trap door in the left-hand back corner of the cabin. It was a square of old wood, maybe 3 feet across, with a ring of rusted iron set into the center. The planks that surrounded it were smooth and polished, as though they had been opened and closed hundreds of times without being worn down by the weather. I touched the ring while kneeling beside it. It was freezing, not cool or shaded wood cold. I'm referring to cold metal that has been exposed to snow. I flinched and pulled my hand away. Then there was the sound. Something moved beneath me. It was heavy, slow, and sluggish, like something being pulled across packed dirt. Then there was silence. It was just an animal, maybe a raccoon, maybe shifting roots, I told myself, but I didn't believe it and just stood there frozen. However, I went, kept the trapdoor shut. I took note of the location on my GPS and just backed out of the cabin as if something would not let me leave. 3 weeks later, I returned. I brought a friend, Connor. He had no interest in superstition. If you showed him a ghost, He would try to disprove it before you could blink, but when I told him what I had really seen, he didn't laugh. He just said, "Let's go see it." We climbed in early, the same route. It felt longer this time. I felt sicker the closer we got to the creek bed. I used some and remained silent. I just pointed through the trees when I saw the same piece of roof. The cabin remained tucked away in the clearing, unchanged. But something had changed. Once sagging to the side, the front door was now straight, balanced correctly within the frame, and appeared to have been carefully reattached. Connor laughed and said it was probably the wind or a deer bumping it. I didn't answer. We went in, scanning the room with our flashlights. Everything was exactly as I remembered. A bed, a stove, and boxes were present, but the date on the wall was a brand new engraving that I had never seen before. This one was recent and occurred on the day we were there. Clean cut, no dust in the groove. It hadn't been there the last time. I didn't argue, but I was aware when Connor said, "Perhaps I missed it." We went straight to the trapdoor and used the crowbar to pry it open. The sound was produced by more than just hinges, as though from somewhere deeper, there was a deeper moan. The opening revealed stone stairs covered in moss that led underground. We fell. It was a small space, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with repurposed timber supports and clay walls. There was no sound at all. In the center of the room was a handcrafted wooden chair with a tall back that faced the stairs. I went out the last flight of stairs. Everything had changed. The temperature did not decrease. It flattened out. It felt like the cold was coming from inside my chest instead of the outside. A thick silence fell. Not only was it silent, but it was wrong. The noise would not go away. The ground felt shaky, but it felt dry. Like I wasn't supposed to be there. Connor walked over to the chair and gave it a boot tap. It creaked. He smiled. I averted my gaze for a moment to examine the distant wall with my flashlight. Another date. That same day again, as fresh as if it had just been cut. I turned to speak to Connor. He was gone. The chair was empty. No sound, no footsteps. Just gone. I stopped and stared at the spot where he had been. I could hear my heart thumping in my ears. I ran back up the stairs, Brisson. He walked around the clearing and out the door, shouting his name. Nothing. No movement. No echo. The forest didn't even appear to be listening. Then, from beneath my feet, I heard the dragging sound once more, slower this time. I forced myself back inside after descending the stairs. The vacant chair was now cocked to one side. Nothing else had changed. I called out to him several times. I can't even think of pausing. I eventually left. I let everything go. GPS, packs, a flashlight, and a crowbar. I ran until I got to the gravel forest road after flagging down a passing truck. The driver glanced at me and opened the door for me. I told the police. They sent out search parties. Rangers hiked with their dogs. They found the cottage, but there was no trapdoor, just a solid wooden floor with no opening, no stairs, and no reason. Story 2. At the age of 28, I was driving alone through a part of North Carolina that I barely knew in an attempt to arrive at a family gathering before dusk. I had taken a detour to avoid traffic. It's one of those scenic detours you regret when you realize that there isn't a gas station for 50 miles and your GPS signal has been dead for 30 minutes. After that, the engine didn't stall. As if a switch had been flipped, it stopped suddenly. I was humming along to a scratchy old classic rock radio when the whole car went dark. The radios died. The dashboard has vanished. Headlights as well. There was complete quiet. No clicks, no warning lights, no fade out. Just gone. The steering wheel locked up slightly, stiff under my hands. And the car coasted in total silence until it gently drifted to a stop on the shoulder. I remember sitting there for a while, staring straight ahead as though everything would restart if I waited long enough. To give away too much, it didn't. I attempted to start the ignition. As it turned, the key felt hollow. With minimal resistance and engine noise, it glides oddly damply, resembling a spoon spinning in thick oatmeal. It was low enough outside to make everything orange, but the sun wasn't quite gone. Early November is rapidly turning to night, and the temperature is low enough that you'll instinctively pull your jacket on. No traffic, not even the sound of another car, just an endless ribbon of cracked black tops slicing through the Appalachian. I check my phone. No signal, not even one of those phantom bars that show up when your phone is just trying to make you feel better. So I went out, more due to habit than anything else. I left the hazards on, even though they were blinking dimly and had very little electricity. The air had a problem. It wasn't cold or strange, but the whole place felt as if it were waiting for something. I foolishly walked a little up the shoulder, hoping to pick up a signal up the slope, while holding my phone in the air. Nothing but the distant hum of trees. As I turned to go back, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another brush break, but there was a small gap in the trees, barely large enough to squeeze through, and I had the feeling that it had been used recently, but not by any natural forces. It looked as though some of the lower branches had been snapped too deliberately and neatly. And from about 100 yards away, I caught a glimpse of a roof through that opening, only the wooden, slanted edge tucked away behind the trees. A wiser me would probably have gone back and stayed with the car. But it could be a cabin, a hunting hut, or something, I thought. Anything was better than freezing my ass off on the side of the road waiting for a tow truck that might never come. I zipped up my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and stepped through the tree break. It was a blanket of wet leaves, old pine needles, and the occasional root that tried to trip me up, but there wasn't much of a path. The large, dense trees that leaned very close muffled everything. As I walked, I kept hoping that the angle would change and reveal more of the cabin, but it didn't. That roofline remained exactly the same. No matter how far I went, it always seemed to be a little bit farther ahead. With the same slope and slight overhang, the cabin appeared to be slowly moving away from me. But I kept going. I eventually came upon it when I stepped into a clearing. It remained intact. It was also poorly maintained. It was simply wrong. It's not a horror movie feeling when your stomach clenches subtly when something isn't quite right. A frame roof, stone chimney. The windows were empty, just open frames without glass, but nothing was shattered or broken. The front porch had a soft dip in the middle, as though it had been sagging for years. I went up the stairs and knocked several times. When you're somewhere you shouldn't be, that flat, gaping silence that suddenly descends. No answer, no internal sounds, not even birds. I waited for a few seconds before turning the knob. It turned easily. The door opened on its own. It just slid in, as though it had been open all day. It had a dry, old smell. Dust and silence, not rottenness. The hearth was filled with cold ash. In front of it was a big chair, covered with a wool blanket as though someone had just stepped out of it. In the corner was a table, this wooden carved mug, a single-place setting, a porcelain plate, and a fork. Everything else did not move. I called out, "Hello," nothing. And then, like a complete idiot, I went inside, my boots barely creaking on the floor. There were no fixtures or lighting, just a few candles melted into stone holders along the walls. I walked slowly past the fireplace and took a quick look inside the kitchen. Antiquated and primitive. There was a HANDP pump sink, some rusting tin cans, and a dry basin with a ring of brown that looked as if it had been there since the Cold War. Beyond it was a corridor, so I went on. Why I didn't go at that time is a mystery to me. Maybe I was still convincing myself that this was just someone's cabin and that they would be back any minute. The bedroom door was already open. The bed had a sunken mattress and a folded cloth at the foot, but no linens. One picture, nailed at eye level, was the only other item on the wall. It was old and black and white. 2 parents, 3 kids, and a family, dressed as if they were attending a 1930s church service. But their faces were scraped off. Violent, aggressive, deep cuts that are not ripped or blurred. The gouges in the wood behind the frame showed that someone had really put some effort into it. I must have stared at it for too long because I heard footsteps, soft and purposeful above me. IF rose. There had been no stairway. I was aware of that. But it sounded like someone was heading upstairs. I tried to hold my breath and took a slow, deliberate step back into the hallway. Then, I saw what I had failed to notice. An old wooden bead curtain covered an archway behind the hearth in the main room. I don't understand how I missed it earlier. It looked as if it had grown directly from the wall. The beads swung slowly. There was no wind. I turned to the door and saw him standing inside the cabin as if he had always been there. Just a long black coat and a sturdy, wide-brimmed hat. No height or bulk. His head was tilted slightly forward, and his arms were by his sides. His face was wrapped in tight, wrongly sewn leather. Pulling over his mouth, nose, and down under his jaw, it had thick, uneven seams that held it together as though someone had sewn it while wearing a blindfold. He did not move or speak. He simply raised one arm and pointed to the table. The place. He asked me to take a seat. I didn't move. He moved forward in silence. No boards were creaking. As though he were weightless and it made no difference, his feet pressed into the board. He pointed again. I sat down. I had no desire to. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped all over. My hands remained in my lap. I kept watching him out of the corner of my eye, anticipating something that was beyond my comprehension. Then he slowly turned and went through the beaded curtain behind the fireplace. I heard a door open, then nothing. I sat motionless in that chair for what felt like an hour. The plate in front of me was empty, but there were crumbs on the table and a smear of something on the fork's tine. There had been food consumption, not too long ago. I eventually stood up. My legs shook. I walked cautiously to the front door, watching the curtain. As I reached for the knob, I heard it. No voice, no sound. It hit me like a memory I didn't know I had. Simply remain. That's when I ran. The door sprang open, and I ran out across the clearing and back through the path, which felt much shorter than it had been on the way in. I slipped on the pine needles. I was scratched by branches. I went on. I didn't look back. Not until I realized my dead car was still there. But my phone finally buzzed after I climbed over the bend. One shaky bar. Enough. I called a tow truck. The new man scarcely spoke. In the middle of the 1950s. I told him about the trail. I told him I saw a cabin, and he looked into the forest for a moment before responding bluntly. Ain't no trail over there. That place burns itself down every time someone finds it. I didn't mention it again, and he just muttered it without blinking. Story 3. After my grandmother passed away the previous winter, she left the cabin to me in her will. I didn't ask for it, and nobody else in the family wanted it either. In the Appalachian foothills, there is only one small, weather-beaten house. There are only woods and solitude for miles around it. The roof sagged. The porch was tilted. The chimney smoked, even when there was no fire. For decades, she'd been living up there by herself, totally off-grid. No power, no plumbing, not even a landline. You couldn't get a phone signal unless you climbed about halfway up the nearest ridge. No road signs, no GPS pin. If you didn't already know where it was, you wouldn't find it. We only went when it was Christmas or Easter when I was a kid. She never came to see us. In fact, she never left the mountain. She had no car and never wrote letters. As though the hills were a part of her, she just stayed up there. I remember her looking out the windows all the time. She had a wiry build and sharp, pale eyes that seemed to be waiting for something. Even though her stories never made much sense, they had a haunting cadence, as though she believed everything she said. It sounded like folklore, but she took it too seriously to be endearing. For example, never sleep facing the window or stay near the fire after sunset. Anyway, I felt that someone should at least come to the place after she died, look through her stuff, and package the valuables. I figured I might stay there for a week or so, clean it out, and then sell it if it wasn't falling apart. I packed one of those big plastic battery lamps, enough food and water for 7 days, and a couple of novels to keep me sane because I knew there wouldn't be any power. When I got there late on a Sunday, it was obvious that the sun was sinking, but it wasn't quite dark yet. It felt harder to breathe up there, and the air was thinner than I remembered. The cabin, too, seemed somehow smaller, as though it had somehow shrunk without her. And the woods around it, I don't know. They weren't as thick as I remember. The trees appeared to have been encroaching for years. It groaned as I stepped onto the porch. I had to shoulder the door open because the wood had swelled from years of moisture. It was as if nothing had changed inside. The curtains are heavy, and the wood stove creaks. The scent hit me right away. Dust, cedar, and a faint musty odor that reminded me of old books in a basement. The first few days were okay, if a little boring. I kept myself busy by emptying dresser drawers, organizing the pantry, and folding linens that hadn't been touched in years. There was a rhythm to something. I got up, made coffee on the propane burner, worked until nightfall, and then read until I fell asleep. I was only impacted by the silence. There was no silence. The silence was absolute. Nothing. No birdsong, no insects. Sound had no intention of staying long. There was one thing I kept avoiding. The shed. About 30 to 40 feet behind the cottage, it was partially obscured by a tangle of brambles and vines. I had seen it 100 times as a kid, but I had never been inside. It was always locked. The kind of lock that looks like it has been rusted shut for 100 years. When I asked her about it, I couldn't have been more than 10 years old. And I remember exactly what she said. It's not for tourists. When she said it, she wasn't creepy. She talked as if she were talking about a room she had stopped cleaning, but I never forgot it. By the 4th day, I had nothing left to clean or organize, so I grabbed a crowbar and went outside. The door swung open after a little effort, sending dried leaves flying inside as the locking gave way. The smell was damp and rotten, like wet cardboard. A couple of mice had made their nests in the insulation. Some of the shelves were completely overturned. I stepped over a broken spade, a stack of moth-eaten coats, and a half-crushed box of old tools. At the back was a wooden cabinet that looked like a tiny arm wire. It had a simple, but safe, sliding latch. I found dozens of notebooks when I opened it. They have plain brown covers with no labels or titles, are all the same size, and are unmarked. I grabbed some and went back to the cabin. That night, sitting at the kitchen table, I started to look through them with a flashlight. No, they weren't journals in the conventional sense. No full sentences, no personal comments. Each submission was numbered and began with a short clipped phrase. The majority only contained 1 or 2 sentences. The entry is 328. It was looking through the windows again. 334. It knows I'm awake. Entry 341. It stayed at the tree line all night. Entry 352. I didn't light the stove, but it came again and again with no context or names. I continued reading in the hopes of discovering more specific information, but I never did. The entries did not even adhere to a specific timeline. She looked like someone cataloging sightings or tracing patterns, trying to remember the rules of a game they didn't want to play. That night, I put the notebooks on the table and tried to distract myself. My eyes kept going to the windows even after I finished reading a few pages of a book. The corners of the room seemed to be drawn closer together, as if the walls had moved while I was not looking. When I fell asleep on the couch, my boots were still on. Sometime after 2 a.m., I woke up feeling disoriented and unable to speak. I noticed that the curtain over the sink had drawn back a little when I went into the kitchen to get water. It might have been the wind, maybe I didn't know I'd brushed it before, but through that gap I saw something. At the edge of the trees, something was standing, too tall, at least 6.5 feet. It was not shaped correctly, incredibly straight and slender, like a human form that has been enlarged without essential features, simply standing there, without any clothes or identifying features. I didn't move or blink, I just stared. My brain tried to classify it. Tree, branch, maybe a trick of the moonlight. Nothing fit. I reached out and flicked on the porch light. Lost. I didn't sleep again after that. I just sat behind the kitchen island and aimed my flashlight at the door. Every muscle in my body tensed, as if I was waiting for someone to kick it open. I forced myself to go outside as soon as the sun came up. I had to find out if I was dreaming. Where the grass had been, it was flattened out. There were 2 long grooves next to each other, as if something had pulled stilts across the yard. No trash, no prints, just the marks that led from the woods to within 10 feet of the porch. Then they stopped or went in the opposite direction. I couldn't tell. I went back to the shed and locked the door after getting the notebooks. I told myself it was a deer. I told myself it was a dream and that tires or falling trees were to blame for the grooves. I repeatedly did that for hours, but I didn't turn off the lights that night. I stayed wrapped up in my blanket on the couch, gazing out the window and taking in every sound. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the back door click. Just once, without a bang or even a creak, and with a deliberate, slow click, as though someone were carefully testing the handle. I waited and listened. Then the screen door shifted, one long water course. A moment later, someone tapped on the kitchen window, 3 times, softly, precisely. I didn't look. I got off the couch and stayed on the floor until some morning light came in through the doorframe. In the morning, I packed my belongings into a suitcase. I didn't even check to see if I had forgotten anything. I just wanted to leave. As I started the truck and got ready to climb in, I noticed something fastened to the porch screen. It was a folded piece of paper. It seemed to have been placed behind the mesh on purpose. It was a notebook page. Entry 443. You shouldn't have stayed alone. I don't remember the drive back. It's all a blur. There were long stretches of road, curves, and trees where I kept checking my rearview mirror as if I might see something running behind me. Story 4. The silent burnout that finally reached a breaking point had been a horrible winter. I had been working in this tiny, windowless office with fluorescent lights that buzzed, and people who talked quietly about VPN disruptions and firmware updates as though they were serious. One day I realized that I couldn't remember the last time I had been outside during the day, so I left. I just wanted to get rid of the numbness, but I didn't have a big plan. I desired discomfort. Not the soul-grinding kind, but the raw, physical kind. The kind that makes you aware of your own survival. It was there that the Appalachian Trail was conceived. I didn't want to go off-ride or find inner peace. I had to prove to myself that I could carry everything I needed, and that I could be reduced to the land, my body, and my will. I moved north after leaving Georgia. The early season crowd consisted of hikers eager to compare gear configurations, publish daily mileage, and share snacks. They were wonderful people, but to be honest, I didn't care about community. The more I walked, the more I craved the silence. Instead of using shelters, I started picking out isolated campsites far from the trail, and eventually, I stopped talking to other hikers altogether. After a while, I stopped trying to follow the fires altogether. I would follow the old fire routes, the faint animal traces, and the game paths that led to nothing. The real test, I reminded myself, was off the grid, away from the safety of well-trod paths and record books. I was in the borderlands between North Carolina and Tennessee when everything changed. The forest was deep and miles from any towns by the end of May. In some types of woods, even the air feels like it's pressing down on you, as though the establishment isn't really welcoming you, just accepting your presence. That day started with tree roots like most oatmeal blisters, but at noon, the light changed. It came in suddenly rather than slowly like ordinary cloud cover. One moment I was looking up through gaps in the canopy at a clear, sunny sky. Then it appeared as though a thick gray tarp had been placed over everything. It wasn't fog or rain. It was heavy, flat, dark, and aimless. I paused and pulled out my GPS. It started to bounce between irrational coordinates and jitter. I checked my compass. It spun slowly, almost languidly, as if drunk, but in any direction I pointed. I attempted to align my surroundings with my real map, but it was unsuccessful. Every rise and bend felt a little strange, as if the landscape had changed several degrees in one night. But I didn't freak out. I've taken a lot of detours. I managed to get my bearings. I followed what looked like a thin game path that sloped northward, hoping that it might eventually lead to an old ranger access road or cross a designated trail. As I hiked on, I didn't like how the forest got denser. There was a heavy silence. as though one were in an unplugged room with padded walls where there were no birdsong or leaves to be heard. That's when I saw it. The hut sat low and square in a shallow dip that was nearly entirely covered in ivy and scrub, and was built from wide logs that looked as if they had not been painted or treated for decades. It seemed out of date, but not abandoned. There were no signs, no number on the door, just a heavy wooden latch, no handle and no glass in the windows, just black, empty holes. So I called out. Nothing. I knocked. There has been no change. I chose to simply take a look. It could have been an old ranger post or a hunting lodge. I didn't want to stay, I just wanted the look. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. When you walk into a room, do you get the impression that something is wrong? Like your pet senses it before your mind does? Dust and furniture were conspicuously absent, as though the room had just been thoroughly cleaned. The ceiling beams were lined with these. Bundles of twig and bone were tied together with broken black thread. Some had pieces of feathers. Some had what looked like animal teeth, but some of those teeth were flat, yellow, and too big, too human, or too near to make me ill. They hung low and swayed gently, but the air was perfectly still. Deep scratches spiraled inward from all sides, encircling a dark blotch in the middle of the floor. Over time, the wood there had taken on a dark, uneven stain and looked wet. It seemed to have been repeatedly soaked in and given a texture just by looking at it. I experienced this odd tug at that moment. Not material. I wasn't pulled along in any way. It was more psychological, like that little frenzied voice in your head that urges you to jump from a height just to see what happens. I immediately pulled back, my heart pounding in my throat. Now the forest was even quieter. It wasn't just the silence. It was the feeling that something or someone was listening. Then I noticed the movement. Maybe 50 feet away, figures are moving between the woods. Not moving, not approaching, just watching. I became icy. One of them came into view. Hunched over in this weird, broken posture, but tall. Far too tall. Its long, thin limbs looked as though they had been stretched. Like peeled bark, its skin was moist and translucent. Its arms reached past its knees. Where its face should have been, there were two wide, dark pits. No depth, no reflection, just emptiness. Then another, and another, each lurching forward in these insect-like halting bursts. No sound, no breathing. They weren't after me. They gazed in the direction of the cabin. One of them brushed past me and entered without a glance. I backed up slowly and silently, so as not to uproot a leaf or break a twig. They didn't react badly. I see only to the building. Then I realized what they were doing. Around the cabin, they were making a pattern. Sticks, stones, and small bones arranged in a frighteningly precise circle. Unlike what they had previously done, it was not symmetrical, random, or practiced. It was moving around the hut's walls, pausing where the floor was most damaged. Then, the sound began. A high-pitched, metal-like mechanical wail screamed against itself from within. The sound began to come from the other people outside, but none of them opened their mouths. A deep, vibrating bone tone hit me in the teeth. It made my skin crawl. My legs buckled and I fell to the side of my pack. My flashlight spilled out. Then, things got worse. The already dim light completely vanished. It was like someone flipping a cosmic switch. No moon, no stars, no outlines. Then, the voices started talking. Not theirs, but mine. My brother's voice was drawn out and warbled. "It's been 5 years since my grandmother's voice died, sir. Where are you? Why did you leave?" Then I spoke in a low, seductive voice. "Enter now. It's safe." I had no one to talk to. They were tearing me apart and taking something away in an attempt to replace what was real. I blindly reached for the flashlight, found it, and switched it on. As the beam hit the clearing, the screams shifted. It became animalistic and savage, like something old, wounded, angry. The one closest to me fell, convulsing, and smoke rose from its flesh. The others screamed and recoiled, flailing their arms across their faces. Legs collapsed in a spasming mess as one inside the cabin exploded through the wall. The light not only wounded them, it obliterated them. I turned it on full power and ran. They retreated a step. One grabbed for me, but it never crossed its arm into the beam. As though the light were acid, it winced. After running until my legs failed me, I crawled. My flashlight flickered once, nearly making me throw up with fear, but it held. After a few hours, I found a creek. I followed the dirt road until I reached a ranger station near the town of Hot Springs. I must have looked terrible. Mud-caked, injured, and barely able to think. They didn't ask me anything more than, I got lost. Before I left, I spotted a supply rack. My flashlights are of the same brand. I picked one up and flipped it over. It is printed on the back. New UV configuration. Story 5. Because the location was so far into the Appalachian wilderness, the GPS stopped functioning before we had even left concrete roads. When we arrived, we were driving on gravel, then dirt, and finally just ruts carved out of the hill. I saw an online ad for an unplugged retreat with access to the wilderness. I took a quick look at it and saw 3 nights, thinking, yes. There was silence, no signal, and no outside distractions. That was exactly what I needed before my senior year engulfed me again. The 3 of us were Milo, Declan, and myself. Declan is the kind of man who needs to be on the go and paces the room, even when we're just watching TV. However, even when the sun is shining through the curtains, Milo never gets up before noon. In addition, he has unique rhythms, no spiritual path, and no friendship bracelet moments. We just needed to relax. Maybe wood smoke, a fire pit, and the freedom of not having to answer for a few days. We met the owner at the foot of a hill that looked as if it had been completely destroyed by the last flood. He didn't give us the directions, he just gave us the coordinates. I parked in an old Silverado with the window down and country music playing. He nodded once, handed me a brass key on a frayed leather loop, and drove off. That was it. It was an old cabin. The boards were dark cedar and the wraparound porch sagged and creaked. 2 small bedrooms had creaking beds and a sink that looked as if it had been rusted for decades. In the pantry, mismatched mugs and half-empty soup cans were stacked as if they had never been washed together. The solar panels on the roof drooped slightly, and if you paid close attention, you could hear a slight, hesitant buzz, like an appliance that isn't sure if it wants to work at all. Then there was that narrow road behind the cabin, just a sliver of trees that had twisted into the darkness and thinned out. We sat on the porch until after midnight on the first night, gathering around the fire pit. The woods were very quiet. It was as if the jungle was holding its breath. No insects, no distant engines, just the pop-pop of burning logs and the hiss of beer cans being opened. I remember how unsettling and comforting it was to hear nothing. My skin relaxed, my thoughts slowed. I think that's when I realized I had to come here. On the second night, there was a certain unease. I became irritated with the trail behind the cabin. I must be honest. We took Milo's half-dead flashlight and headed out with hope stronger than lumens. The road quickly narrowed. The roots bent underfoot. Branches rubbed against our chests and tangled in our hair. It took more concentration to walk than I had thought. After about a kilometer, we emerged into a clearing. It was round and clean, with grass that seemed to have been gently pressed down, and oddly perfect. No signs of disturbance. The grass was flattened, gravel was scattered, and another trail ran along the edge. It's not really a trail, but it's something. Declan took a look at his offline map. He recommended going around the service road, a reasonable voice in the woods. We fell behind. A few minutes later, I saw movement, low in the tree. A flicker went through the leaves. My pulse accelerated. It looked like a deer or a coyote at first, but when it unfolded upright, it was much too smooth to be an animal. Not a quick stand-up, just uncurling. Milo whispered, Declan's typically awkward laugh faltered. "It was probably another hiker," he said, but I sensed a tinge of doubt in his voice. He was convincing himself. That's when we saw the perch. There's a wooden hunting stand hidden away, as old as the cabin or older, with rusted nails and moss growing up the ladder like vines. Declan climbed up out of instinct. I moved slowly. Milo paced underneath, his hands buried deep in his hoodie pockets. The view expanded from above. The hills, the trees, the starry meadow that never ends. In the distance, there was also movement. Instead of swinging or wavering, it was a white light pulse that was firing. It flipped forward, beaming unflinchingly, fast, recklessly fast. As it sailed over treetops, it appeared to defy gravity. "No track down there," I retorted. No one answered. We just stared. Then Declan cupped his hands and yelled, "Hey, buddy!" The light stopped in the middle of his sentence, as if he didn't want to lose his temper in the dark. Like a lensless camera beam, it angled upward, stopped dead in front of us, and simply locked on. We came to a stop. Then the blinking stopped. No fade, no slow dim. Like someone slamming a light switch. We went down. As he started back toward the cabin, Milo's head was already over his shoulder. The forest appeared more confined, and each tree seemed closer. Leaves and twigs snapped and crunched louder than they should have. My throat tightened. Behind us, something moved. Nothing is clear. Just a shape moving at our speed. No chase click for the flashlight. The branches did not snap. Just that ever-present presence. We pushed through the trees and bushes faster. Finally, the cabin came into view. There are no lights on. No one is on the porch. We locked the doors. In front, that old back door, which was never truly safe. The interior was dark and chilly. We sat in the main room, warming up with the cheap beer and silently scanning the area for movement while gazing out the windows. No one tried to lighten the mood. No searching for rational explanations. No one stopped on command in midair, and no one said, "Maybe it was a hunter." This is because no one runs headlamp off into dense forests. When they follow Lowe's three strangers back into the wilderness, nothing is left behind. We set out at dawn. I dropped the key into the lockbox without looking back. We didn't check our phones because it took an hour of driving before the signal finally caught up. We've never talked about what happened. Story 6. In the Appalachian Mountains, possibly near the Tennessee-North Carolina border, my uncle owns a small off-grid cabin that is nestled off an unnamed gravel road. He mostly uses it for hunting, but he agreed to let me use it for a week in early July that summer. There were no adults nearby to offer supervision, so my two friends and I were by ourselves in the middle of nowhere. He must have believed that it would help him grow as a person. To be honest, it sounded like the best idea ever. We didn't want to frighten ourselves. That was not the kind of journey. We simply needed a break from the noise, you know. No phones, no Wi-Fi, and no one to see how we're doing. It felt like a button to reset. The site itself is quite straightforward. Nestled in a small gap between trees is the cabin. There is no running water. The only water source is a crank pump 10 feet from the back porch. The electricity comes from an antiquated gas generator that is more temperamental than useful. It may have had light for an hour the first night when we tried to run it, but then it sputtered out, leaving us to continue setting up with flashlights in the dark. A twisted outhouse without plumbing can be found 50 steps into the trees. There is a hand crank radio that can detect a 1 AM signal if you stand in the right spot, and a wood stove that releases smoke throughout the cabin unless you open the vent precisely. It took us about 2 days to discover that. After the first night, everything we owned had a barbecue pit smell to it. Before we left, my uncle gave me these 3 fundamental rules. Keep the fire pit covered when not in use. Steer clear of nighttime wandering, and don't leave food out unless you want raccoons or worse to raid your possessions. He muttered, "bears," and worse things if you believe in that sort of thing. With a half smile that implied he was kidding but also that he wasn't, he said that. Anyway, it was Corey, Jules, and me. Corey was among those who laughed before he joked. Loud voice, a lot of vitality, and an enduring wisdom. He had a way of making you feel untouchable when you were around him. Jules was more composed, cautious, and thoughtful. He actually read the instructions for the water filter, checked the path signs twice, and brought an extra lantern, despite the fact that we all made fun of him for packing too much. On the first night, we constructed a fire behind the hut. We brought some hot dogs and canned chili. They sat around roasting food and laughing. The forest was calm. The sky seemed unnaturally clear. It wasn't even cold, just the perfect summer evening air. When we first started playing this game, we challenged each other to share the most strange thing we had ever seen. It was nothing big, just teen stuff. Jules stopped abruptly as I was about to say something dumb that I had seen online. His whole face changed. He just stared into the woods and said, "Calm as anything." He waits alone in the pines to the east without blinking. Then he blinked, looked around, and asked himself why we were all looking at him like he had a second head. Corey burst out laughing and said, "Go while the moon's still low." But Jules gave us a puzzled look, as though he really didn't understand what we were talking about. "Okay, creepy solid bit." "I forgot what I said," he swore. Claimed to have dozed off for a while and come back to discover us motionless as statues. I was a little annoyed by that. It's weird, but not in a spooky way. That night, I slept poorly. The next morning, I started to wonder. To the east, I remembered what he had said. I found this old compass in the cabin supplies box. East led the way down a small game road that wound between two ridges covered in moss and heavily pined. The air changed as I walked. The temperature drop came as a surprise. You felt as though the woods were waiting for you. About 0.5 miles in, I came upon this surprising clearing. In the middle was a low, long mound that looked like a graveyard but was older, tangled up in itself and covered with vines and moss. At the far end was a wooden post that was blackened and cracked. Deep vertical cuts ran down its face, as if someone were trying to carve something in or out and giving up in the middle. It seemed to have been forgotten, as it was intended to be. I didn't stay long. Back at the cabin that night, I told them about the clearing. Before I could finish describing it, Jules went pale, as though all the blood had been taken out of him at once. He whispered 2 nights before we left for the vacation that he had been there before in a dream. The same mound, the same post, and the same trees are to the east. He hadn't mentioned it because he thought it was all in his head. But it no longer appeared to be a coincidence. We stayed inside that night, gathered around a few flashlights, and kept the stove going. No one spoke, but Jules whispered something next to the fire. Then it happened again the next night. While we were playing cards, Corey tried to be normal and giggled at something. Then, with this detached look, he rose very slowly and said in an odd, flat voice, "Past the roots, beneath the stone, he moves." He blinked, looked around, and sat down as though nothing had happened. I looked at Jules. We said nothing. We didn't have to. For each of us, it held significance. The next morning was different. The side of the cabin was scratched. Deep, deliberate gouges ran down the wall as if something massive had dragged its claws across it. 5 stars. Our firewood pile seemed to have been knocked backward by someone or something trampling on it. One of our coolers went missing. When we found it, about 20 yards into the forest, it was torn open and partially covered in leaves. During breakfast, none of us spoke. Later that day, I convinced Corey to come back to the clearing with me. Jules would not come, asserted that there was no air. The trail felt heavier, as if it were pushing back. When we reached the clearing, we both just stopped. The mound had been torn apart by them. Something had ripped through it from the inside. The post had broken in two and was lying face down in the dirt. The earth was ripped and bare, as if whatever was underneath it had clawed its way out. Corey didn't say anything until we were halfway back. We had nothing but a sliding wooden bar, and when he muttered, "This feels like a warning," We bolted the cabin door that night. Jules strung soda cans and fishing line across the windows to make an alarm. We left the stove on low and remained in our boots. Around 3 in the morning, we heard the tapping, not on the door, but on the glass. One pause, one tap, one more. Then someone knocked. 3 slow thuds sounded on the wall beside our bunks. Then something moved across the roof. Heavy, deliberate. You could hear the weight in the rafters. Feel the structure growing with every step. Jules whispered, but it wasn't his voice. "He's coming because you looked. He sees you now." Corey picked up the hatchet. I had my uncle's old hunting knife with me. Jules remained motionless as she cuddled up on the couch and gazed. Then something banged on the door. The whole frame shook, but that was all. No second hits, just silence. There, we waited for what felt like hours. Morning finally came. Outside, we found hoof prints. They're too big for a horse. They circled the cabin twice before vanishing into the forest. Without speaking to each other, we packed, covered the fire pit, and hurried off on foot. My uncle was waiting at the place where he dropped us off. We didn't talk on the way home. After that, everything sort of fell apart. Jules moved out of state and changed his phone number. Corey deleted all of his accounts and ceased answering texts. I've heard Lawson T. left school. My uncle agreed to let me use the cabin again the next summer. No, I informed him. Didn't give a reason. Story 7. Music. I had taken a few weeks off from work. I had been missing weekends, working long hours at the office, and answering emails at midnight, as if nothing had changed. One day, I kind of gave up. I realized I couldn't remember how I got to work that morning while I was examining a spreadsheet at my desk. That's when I knew I had to leave, if only for a short time. I grew up in Kentucky, where the mountains always seemed strangely reassuring. Not a lyrical escape of any sort. When you grow up in such a tranquil setting, it just never really leaves you. My grandfather traversed the Appalachian Mountains on foot. When he passed away, I was left with this old topographic map that he had scrawled on over the years. Alongside fire routes and ridgeal lines that are no longer even discernible on modern maps, it included faint pencil notations, tiny symbols, and initials. One track caught my attention in particular. The faint line leading up onto a ridge was unfamiliar to me. No name, no label, just a small arc snaking away from a barely noticeable road. I studied satellite images. There are no structures or signs of recent habitation. That's exactly what I wanted. I essentially packed lightweight items. My first aid kit, phone, camera, and maybe 8 hours supply of food and water. I departed early that morning, spent roughly 2 hours driving east, pulled off onto the shoulder of an old access road, and started hiking. The trail was unmaintained, just as I had expected. It was barely there, less alive than the memory of a trail, but that didn't bother me. Having to watch my step was fun. I liked being by myself. The wood is dense. The tall, closely spaced pines block most of the light. There was no wind, just the occasional snap of a twig beneath your feet, or the gentle rustle of something small moving off course. In places where the laurel had gotten so thick, I had to squat and push my way through. I felt increasingly alone as I went, as though the forest was encroaching on me. After 4 miles, the trail started to climb. It's not too steep, just enough to burn the legs. I continued to the ridge's westward bend. I became aware of it at that point. A cabin. I was motionless as I gazed at it. It wasn't exactly hidden, but it was positioned so that you wouldn't notice it unless you were at that exact bend. Seen from the wrong angle, it had merged into the tree line. It wasn't new, it wasn't a wreck, but it was old and solid. The heavy, gray planks were put together with such care that it seemed someone had meant them to last. Moss grew in the seams, but not in a decomposing way. The cottage and the forest appeared to have come to an agreement. The stovepipe leaned slightly to one side, as though it had grown tired over the years. The porch sagged toward the middle, but the planks didn't seem to be rotten. It felt like a location that had existed for a very long time, largely forgotten and unconcerned. I looked around. There were no tire markings, no boot prints, no litter, just dead leaves and silence. I called once. Nothing. Not even an echo. My voice sounded weak. I know how it sounds, but I had no intention of going inside. I was just curious, the sneaky curiosity that emerges when something doesn't seem quite right. The door was unlocked. I touched the handle lightly, and it swung inward without resistance, as though it had been placed in a jar for me alone. Inside, it was naked. A cot in a corner without any covers or pillows, just a frame and a tiny mattress. A cast iron stove stood on a level slab of stone near the far wall. A table, hand-cut from rough boards, and a single chair were present. Additionally, there is a chipped blue enamel mug on the table. That was the only real sign of use. Oddly, there was no dust either. The place looked unaltered but not abandoned. I only took a few quick pictures, being uncreative. One of the cot, one of the table with the mug, and one of the stove. I was nearly back to the door when I stopped. There were 2 mugs. The second one was white, bone white, and sat beside the blue one as though it had always been there. However, I am aware of what I saw. I'm an accomplished photographer. I look, then I fire. And there was only one mug when I looked. I stared at my memory for what felt like an eternity, trying to force it to rebuild itself, but it refused. That's when I heard it. A creak. Not a step. A single, slow weight shift on a floorboard behind the rear wall. I didn't call out this time. I just backed away, quietly and cautiously, as though I was waiting for some sudden movement. I went back to the path and started to walk. Not running. Running sounds like it might make noise. I just walked steadily, trying to keep my head straight and keep my mind from wandering. About half a mile down, I froze once more. My pack is gone. I had left it on the porch and leaned it against the railing before I went inside. It wasn't my fault. I was not carrying it. And that pack contained everything: phone, wallet, food, water, and car keys. Without it, I was stuck out there. I stood for a while, breathing and clenching my teeth. Then I turned around. The cabin looked different when I returned. Subtly wrong, but not significantly. The door was open wider and a little more ajar than before. The interior looked darker and less welcoming. My pack was gone. I yelled out again, forcing my voice to be as steady as if I were talking to a stranger on a trail. Not accusing, just reaching out. That's when I heard the voice. Not inside the cabin, but from behind it. I couldn't understand the words, if they were words at all. It resembled slowed down or distorted speech in its pattern. Not hostile, not friendly, just patient and waiting. I retreated 2 paces, then another, and there it was. My pack zipped up neatly, as though it had been placed there with care, right in the middle of the route. It wasn't there just now. I knelt down and opened it, my hands trembling now. Everything was packed carefully, save for the camera. I dug until I found it, then turned it on. All of the previous photos were still there. They're gone, corrupted, or without thumbnails, except for the 3 from the cabin, as though those moments had been frozen in time. I then checked the time. The time was around 6 o'clock. I checked my phone. The same thing. I checked my watch. Perfectly matched. I started my hike at 10 in the morning. I know how fast I am. The whole loop should have taken no more than 5 or 6 hours, even with bushwhacking. But somehow, I'd lost almost 8. Once again, I walked away without stopping. I didn't run, I didn't turn around, but I also didn't want to draw attention. When I reached my car, I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were white-knuckled from the whole journey back. I didn't unpack. I left the equipment in the trunk and just sat on my couch that evening, trying not to think. Lights on, music playing. Story 8. Music. At the age of 22, I gave my permission to watch Romy. In the middle of the Appalachian Mountains, 2 hours away from the nearest town, her parents had rented a cabin, and there was only a payphone at a gas station in that town. They were attending a corporate retreat which included awkward icebreakers, matching t-shirts, and trust falls. All I had to do was spend one night with their daughter, Rami. They offered food that was already in the refrigerator, $200, and no dogs. I said yes without really thinking about it. The drive there was eerie. The gravel road wound through thick forests before cutting up the slope of a ridge. Then my car scuffed against the branches on a small private dirt road. The whole time I felt like I was slipping into an irrevocable memory. When I finally pulled up, they were on the porch, bright and at ease, as though they had done this 100 times before. They handed me a hand-drawn map. That was just in case the GPS didn't work, they clarified. I put the map in my pocket, even though I was laughing. They showed me the gas stove knob that I should not touch, assured me that Romy had brushed her teeth, and said she would probably draw all night. Her mother says she's easy. Then they backed out of the driveway, and their SUV disappeared into the night. I stood with the door in my hand, squinting into the twilight, listening to the fade of their car's engine on the porch. Then there was utter silence, just me. I found Rami coloring cross-legged on the rug with a focus I didn't even have at 22. I said, "Want anything? Snack, water, TV?" She shook her head, lowered her head, and then fell as quiet as a forest. "You hear them walking yet?" I asked, squinting. "Who?" she asked, barely pausing. "The people outside." I looked, but no one was there. But she didn't argue. She just turned the page and colored some more. At around 9, I led her upstairs to the bedroom at the end of the hall, shrugging and dropping it, thinking, okay, weird kid. Movie quote, maybe. Quietly, she climbed in. She said, "They knock first. No nightlight, no bedtime story, just knees tucked up, staring at the ceiling, waiting." I stood in the doorway. "Who knocks?" "They don't like when people don't answer." "Okay," I forced a smile. "Good night." Back downstairs, I found the fireplace next to a small TV and DVD player. No Wi-Fi. Perfect. I curled on the couch and tried to focus on the articles I saved for a rainy day, but I couldn't. The house spoke in creaks and cracks, unexpected and loud, like it knew I was listening. At 10:12, I heard slow footsteps outside the back door, 3 deliberate steps, then silence. I muted my phone, heart ticking faster. No wind, no rustling leaves. I turned on the porch light. The yard glowed pale yellow, nothing moved, no heads peeking, no shadows skidding across the deck. Still, I locked the door twice and pulled the curtain closed. Then, upstairs, a soft shift, not falling, more like someone leaned too far. Ramie's voice floated down. "Are they inside now?" I swallowed. Went upstairs fast. She sat up in bed, knees to chest, staring at the wall. "I didn't open anything," I said softly. "They don't wait forever," she stated. "Go to sleep, Romy." I went back downstairs and hugged my blanket as if it could shield me. I set the flashlight and a kitchen knife on the floor beside me. Useless, I know, but I needed something. At 11:48, I heard clicking soft fingernail dragging against wood. First from the left, then the right. I pressed my ear to the wall. Nothing. Heart in my throat. I flipped the curtain. Bare footprints in the dust outside. Faint, skinny ones and wider ones mixed together, circling the cabin. No shoes, no boots. I locked the front door again and closed every curtain, every light off. Then I headed upstairs. Her bedroom door stood open. Rami stood at the window again. "They're at the trees now," she said. "They get closer when someone's scared. Step away from the window," I told her quietly. I shut the curtains, carried her downstairs, my heart banging so loud I thought she heard it, set her on the couch, turned on every light again. We sat in silence. Then, at 12:41, everything went black. Just snapped off. No fizz, no flicker. The whole cabin swallowed in darkness. My phone showed no signal, no bars, no service. She didn't say a word. I got up and did a full perimeter check. Doors locked, no windows open, but the air had shifted, denser, settled around us like a curtain pulled closed. At 2:37, someone knocked. 3 sharp, deliberate thumps. I froze, didn't move. It didn't knock again. I turned to Romy. The couch was empty. My skin went ice cold. I bolted upstairs. She stood in the back room, barefoot at the window. "They're waiting," she whispered. I grabbed her, slammed the door, shoved a chair under the handle, shoved her into the coat closet near the kitchen. We stayed there. Darkness, silence, my breathing loud enough to scare myself. We didn't say a word. I didn't blink. She just pressed into the coat rack, arms wrapped around her knees. At 6:23 a.m., the lights flickered on like nothing happened. At 6:40, the parents pulled up, smiling and chirping like Sunday errands. Everything okay, her mom asked. I didn't answer. I walked past, got in my car, and drove until I hit the first gas station with cell service. Story 9. I was 17 when I agreed to look after my uncle's place out in the Appalachians. He'd lined up a trip to Arizona. Something about desert air and a high school buddy he hadn't seen since the 8s, and asked if I could stay at his cabin for a few nights while he was gone. He always called it the camp, which sounded a little more rugged and nostalgic than it really was. What it actually looked like was a wooden box someone had forgotten to finish. Just 2 rooms, a slanted roof, and a small porch that tilted a little to the left, like it was too tired to stand up straight anymore. It sat halfway up a wooded slope, surrounded by trees that looked like they'd been leaning in for years, like they were trying to take the place back. The nearest town with a gas station was about 2 hours away, more if it rained. He built the place in the 70s with his brother, though you wouldn't guess it had ever been a 2-person job. They never finished the foundation, just plopped the cabin on a few stone footers and called it good. Everything creaked, everything leaned. The floor had a slight tilt that made you feel like you were walking uphill no matter which direction you went. There was no plumbing, no reception. The stove ran off a propane tank, and for light, there was a generator you had to yank 3 times in just the right rhythm to get it sputtering. Even when it worked, most of the bulbs in the place were either dead or so dim they looked like they were trying to retire. Then there was Sadie. She was his dog, sort of an old mutt who'd spent more time at that cabin than most people I knew had spent in their own homes. Half shepherd, half something scrappy and uncertain. Her job supposedly was to keep away the coyotes, but she was so slow-moving and mellow, I wasn't convinced she'd even lift her head if one showed up on the porch. She had this sigh deep and dramatic like very movement cost her 1 more day of life. I figured I'd stay 4 or 5 nights, no more. It was summer. School was out and I wasn't doing much anyway. I liked the idea of getting away. Maybe I'd get some writing done. Maybe I'd finally finish a few pages in that sketch pad I always carried, but never really used. I packed a duffel with the essentials, clothes, a flashlight, a notebook, some pens, a bag of trail mix I'd regret by the 2nd day, and enough instant mac and cheese to get scurvy. The first night was fine, peaceful, even. I made a small fire in the old hearth, cooked dinner on the rusty stovetop, and sat on the floor while Sadie stretched out like a rug and snored. The kind of snore that starts in the lungs and ends in the floorboards. It felt weirdly comforting, like background noise from a movie you weren't watching. By midnight, I was lying on the cot in the back room, trying to decide if the ceiling was sloped or if my head was just tilted funny. The air was cold in a way that felt old, like the kind of cold that's been sitting in the walls for years. I woke up a few hours later with no idea why. My heart was pounding, not just racing, but pounding like I'd been running in my sleep. I didn't hear anything, but my body was telling me someone was there. Right there, standing just past the wall in the main room. Not moving, not speaking, just there. I grabbed my flashlight and hit the button. It flickered once, then steadied. I swept the beam across the room. Sadie was awake. She wasn't barking. She wasn't growling. Just staring at the door with her ears up and her body tense. Like every muscle was waiting for something to happen. Her eyes didn't move. She didn't blink. She was locked in like she saw something I couldn't. I sat up, waited. Nothing happened. No knock, no creak, just silence. I didn't sleep again that night. The next day, everything felt heavy. The quiet outside wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt off, like the forest had gone into hiding. I chopped wood, though there was already more than enough stacked under the porch. I hiked up the trail behind the cabin, tried to distract myself. From the ridge, I looked down into a gully full of thorny brush and trees that looked dead, even though they weren't. I didn't hear birds, didn't see squirrels, even the bugs were quiet. I told myself it was just the time of day, or maybe the altitude, but I didn't really believe it. That night I checked the locks twice. Not that it mattered. The door had a flimsy metal slide, more rust than mechanism. The windows didn't even have proper latches, just these little wooden pegs you could wedge into place. Sadie curled up by the door again. This time, I didn't even try to sleep. At 1:40 a.m. on the dot, I heard it. 3 knocks. Not on the door, on the back wall. The one with nothing behind it but dirt and trees. No porch, no steps, no reason for anyone to be there. I sat bolt upright. Sadie let out a low, rumbling growl, not angry, more like a warning. The kind of sound a dog makes when it knows you're about to see something you'll wish you hadn't. I waited. Nothing else came. No voice, no footsteps. Just those 3 slow, deliberate knocks, almost polite. I stayed like that until the sun came up. My flashlight stayed on the whole time, the beam burning a pale spot on the opposite wall. Sadie never took her eyes off the door. In the morning, I walked around to the back wall. Nothing. The soil was packed too tight for tracks. No scuffs, no scratches, nothing to even prove I'd heard anything. I nearly convinced myself I'd imagined it until later that afternoon. That's when I saw it. A circle 15 feet from the cabin near the edge of the trees. Perfectly round, 6 feet across. Just bare. No leaves, no moss, no sign of anything alive. Just clean scraped dirt like something had spun or pressed into the ground until it wore the forest away. No prints around it, no drag marks, just the circle. I didn't step near it. I just stood there and stared while something in my stomach sank like a stone. It wasn't just strange, it was wrong, like the ground itself had been marked. That night, I made a choice. No sleeping. I turned off the generator before midnight. No more noise. I sat by the window with my flashlight off and waited, watching the outline of the trees under a thin slice of moon. Sadie didn't move from her spot near the hearth. Her eyes stayed on the window. No blinking, no shift. At 2:13 a.m., I heard it again. Movement. Soft, slow steps in the pine needles outside. Not stumbling, not hurried, just careful, like someone trying not to wake the house. It circled the cabin once, twice, then silence. Then the door knob rattled. Just a little, a gentle test, like someone had never used one before and was curious what it did. Sadie didn't move. Her ears twitched, but her body stayed frozen. So did mine. After a while, the noise stopped. In the morning, I walked outside and saw it. A footprint near the generator shed in softer soil. It wasn't right. Too long, too wide, toes uneven, spread out like they didn't belong on a human foot. The heel had pressed in deep, like something heavy had stood there and shifted once. It was barefoot, but not human. I didn't think. I just packed. I left a note for my uncle. Said the generator was being weird and that I'd heard some animals at night. Promised I'd swing back in a week. I loaded the last of my stuff into the truck, and when I turned to look at the cabin one last time, I saw it. 3 lions carved into the wooden door, straight, parallel, deep enough to expose fresh pale wood beneath the surface. Not claw marks, too. Even they looked intentional, like someone wanted me to see them before I left. I got in the truck. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, hand on the key, staring out at the trees like they were waiting for something. Then I turned the key. I drove until I hit pavement. Didn't stop, didn't look back, and I never went back. Story 10. My shift at Mel's ended at 5, but I didn't head home right away. Instead, I cut through the gravel lot out back and slipped behind the tree line next to that old utility shed. Half-collapsed thing covered in ivy, just sitting there, like it forgot it used to matter. Back behind it in that little clearing, Caleb and Wes were already waiting. They had this old lowers map printed from someone's Tumblr post. No street names, no labels, just a satellite shot of the ridge above town and a black square off to the side. No one knew what it was. No roads led to it. Wes said it was an abandoned ranger cabin. Caleb claimed the ranger who lived there just vanished one day. Personally, I thought they were full of it. But I wasn't going to correct them. Not because I believed the map, but because I hadn't wanted to go home in a while, and this felt like something else. Something better than silence. We started walking, cutting through woods that got darker faster than they should have. We crossed 3 narrow deer trails, barely more than trampled grass. Then, an old creek that had dried up long before I ever worked at Mel's. There was a stretch of broken barbed wire, sagging low enough to duck under without ripping your jacket. None of us talked much past that point. You'd think we would have joked or argued or something, but the deeper we got, the quieter everything around us got too, like the trees were pressing in closer. The air felt heavier, not colder, not humid, just thick, like breathing through a wool sleeve. I kept glancing over my shoulder, not because I thought we were being followed, but because every step felt a little too soft, like the ground was padded. I carried the flashlight, only one that worked. The others brought theirs, but of course, they either forgot batteries or packed ones that were half dead. I remember feeling weirdly responsible, like it was my job to keep the beam steady even when my hands were getting clammy. Caleb saw the roof first. You couldn't even call it a cabin from a distance. Just a patch of dark shingles caved in under a mess of dead branches. Looked more like a ruined shed than a building anyone could have lived in. If he hadn't pointed it out, I think we might have walked right past it. We made a slow loop around it. There weren't any windows, just that sagging roof and planks nailed to the sides like someone tried to fortify it. Eventually, we found the door, not warped but crooked, like it had been kicked in and patched back together by someone who didn't care how it looked. Caleb pulled it open and the thing swung wider than I expected. The air inside hit me before I even stepped in. Not musty, not moldy, just still unmoving. No furniture, one rusted metal bucket in the corner, and a weird fan-shaped pattern made of sticks on the floor. The walls were bare, but someone had hammered mismatched planks over a slit in the back, like a window that never belonged there in the first place. The boards overlapped unevenly, almost like someone was trying to keep something out or in. The floor didn't creak. Even when we walked all the way in, it was solid, which somehow made it creepier. Old buildings are supposed to give under your feet. This one felt like it had been drained of sound. Wes laughed a little and said, "Looks like someone tried to turn a root cellar into a hunting lodge." That's when we noticed it. A hatch, dead center of the floor. Perfect square. No handle, no lock, just a bent loop of wire hammered into one side. You wouldn't have spotted it unless you were looking. I crouched and ran the flashlight over the seam. There was this black stuff sealing it. Looked like tar, but dry, and chipped around the edges. Whoever sealed it had meant for it to stay closed. Before I could say anything, Caleb reached down and yanked it open. There was no ladder, no rungs, just a square hole, pitch black. The light didn't reach far. The shaft looked smooth, too smooth, like the inside of a chimney that had been polished. The beam just stopped a few feet down, not faded. Stopped like the darkness swallowed it whole. Wes leaned over it and spat. We waited. Nothing. No sound. Not even a faint splash. Just nothing. "That's not right," he muttered. Caleb stood up slower this time. He wasn't grinning anymore. None of us were. There was something about the way the air pressed down through that opening. Like the space below wasn't empty, but filled with something dense, silent, waiting. Wes crouched down again. I thought he was going to spit a second time, but he just leaned close like he was listening. Then my flashlight went dead. One second I'm lighting the hatch, the next it's pitch black. I smacked it against my palm against the floor. Nothing. Wes's voice broke the silence. "There's someone down there. Not scared?" not confused, just certain. We stood there frozen, trying to breathe like that would help us hear better. Then Caleb called out, "Hello." We waited, and then we heard it knock. Just one, not from the trees, not from the roof, from below, directly under the hatch. That sound hit me in the chest, like it knew exactly where we were. Caleb slammed the hatch shut hard enough to make the floor shudder. I didn't even realize I was backing away until my hand hit the door frame. Wes hadn't moved. He was still staring at the hatch like it was about to open again. We stepped outside, and the second we did, the flashlight blinked back on. Worked perfectly. No flickers, no delay. I checked the batteries. Nothing wrong. No one said a word for the next 20 minutes. We crossed the barbed wire again, then the creek, then the last trail. When we got to the gravel lot, Wes peeled off without saying goodbye, just turned and walked. That night, he left our group chat. Neva messaged again. Caleb stopped posting anything the week after. I kept going back to the photos I took before the hatch opened. I was sure I had a few from when Wes was kneeling by the hole, and I did. One photo showed him down on one knee, flashlight angled down. But in the corner of the frame, just barely visible in the light, there was a hand, long fingers, pale skin. The palm was up, resting against the inside edge of the hatch, not reaching, just waiting. I didn't take that photo. I know exactly where I aimed my phone. That wasn't it. I deleted the rest, but I couldn't delete that one. We never talked about going back, but a couple months later, I saw Caleb outside the Gray Line station downtown, just pacing in slow circles. He looked rough, pale, like he hadn't eaten in days. When he finally saw me, he looked like he didn't recognize me at first. He said he couldn't stop dreaming about the hatch, said it was open in his dreams that someone was calling his name from below. I haven't seen him since. I haven't stepped foot in those woods again either.